timely discussion. In fact, our program, the CBU social work program, we had begun planning almost 2 months ago to have a series of professional development webinars and discussions throughout the summer. And this was previously scheduled for a discussion on cross-systems communications and collaboration. But given the times we are in around our nation, that really seemed out of context. And so I'm so pleased tonight that I'm able to be joined by my colleagues, Dr. Brown and Dr. Mexico, as we discuss advancing equitable and inclusive policy. Is this a moment or a movement? Before I get started, I just want to introduce, because there's some guests. I see there are lots of students with us today, which I'm glad to see you here. And we're going to address you very specifically later in our discussion. But there are also some guests that I just want to introduce my colleagues today. We are joined today by Dr. Stephen Brown, who currently serves as an associate professor of behavioral sciences at California Baptist University in Riverside, California. Prior to coming to CBU, he was an administrator at Mount San Antonio College. Dr. Brown has an extensive experience in areas of foster care and adoptions. Dr. Brown has served as a presenter and a panelist on several conferences through his research. He conducted dealing with the issue of African-American male achievement, but more specifically, student athletes in the area of retention. So thank you, Dr. Brown, for joining us tonight. We look forward to this discussion. And then we're also joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Antonio Mexico, who serves also as an assistant professor of social work at CBU. He has served in the fields of child welfare and mental health for the past 15 years. During that time, he has provided direct counseling, case management, and child abuse prevention service to the most severely abused and neglected children and their families throughout the Inland Empire and Orange County. He also specializes in program development, data-informed policy review, and outcome analysis. He currently participates on state work groups advocating for at-risk youth, policy reform, statewide wraparound implementation, and is particularly focused on services geared towards addressing the needs of marginalized population and foster youth. And if I haven't met you yet, my name is Phil Breitenbuscher. I also serve as an assistant professor of social work at CBU. Prior to joining CBU, I had the privilege of working as a consultant at the Center for Children and Family Futures, where we provided technical assistance and training and research at the intersection of child welfare and juvenile justice and mental health. I also had the privilege of conducting some research and looking at disproportionality and disparities in the juvenile court system, and I'm going to have the privilege to share some of that research with you later on today. So again, welcome everyone for being here. Thank you to my panel of presenters. We're so glad you are here, and so glad all of our participants are here as well. However, as customary here at CBU, before we jump right into this important discussion, I would just like to lead us in just a moment of prayer as we discuss this really important discussion. So if you wouldn't mind just please joining me in just a moment of prayer, and I'll bow my head. Oh, Heavenly Father, our hearts are heavy, broken. Please give us eyes to see and ears to hear where your Spirit is working, Lord. Help us to see every person the way that you see them. Break our hearts for what breaks yours, God. Let us not merely say that we love each other. Give us the strength to mourn with those who mourn, to weep with those who weep. Let your justice roll like waters. Let your righteousness and love flow from us like rivers of the living river. Purify our hearts, Lord, and fill us with genuine hunger for justice, for mercy, and for true peace. Heavenly Father, let justice and mercy start with me. Amen. Thank you for joining in that moment of prayer. I wanted to just real quickly review today's objectives. We are hoping to just really continue a discussion that started last week with our colleagues, Dr. Hayes and Dr. Costello, in which they began to ask the question of us, are we merely actors? Are we allies, or are we accomplices in this reform and in pursuit of social justice. And we're going to continue that discussion where we looked at it from an internal perspective. And tonight we're going to have that discussion from a policy perspective. We'll be exploring biblical themes related to social justice. We're going to review a case example. We'll discuss policymaking as a vehicle for social change and consider evidence-informed practices for implementing social justice policy. And we're going to hopefully continue with the discussion on how we can advance social justice beyond just moments and into movements. So with that, it's really my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Brown.
Thank you, Professor Breitenbuescher. First off, I saw him in the room tonight. I wanted to thank Dr. Charles Lee Johnson because this really actually began in our faculty meeting. And I personally wanted to thank him for creating a space for us to discuss this issue. And I think that was probably what really pushed this conversation forward and really served to sort of galvanize us to do what we did tonight. So Dr. Lee Johnson, thank you, sir. I know you're listening from afar, but we wanted to give you a special shout out for being brave enough to create this space for us and to allow us to be who we are in this space. So thank you for that. Now, we began this discussion talking about whether this was a moment or a movement, right? And I think this began a conversation for us about what we were seeing, right? All the things that are happening that we see via social media, that we see on the news, and there were a lot of things that were weighing on us heavily. You know, so much so that we had to stop and pause as a department to sort of just check in to see how one another was feeling, right? I shared with them what was called a car ride conversation that I had with my daughter. And this is sort of what fueled a lot of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. But her basic question at 11 years old was why is everybody so mad, right? Why are people burning down their own neighborhoods? Why are the cops out? Why are all these things happening around us and what's going on, right? So in our traditional car ride conversation, I jumped into professor mode and I put my professor hat on. I took my dad hat off, I guess. And we had a conversation. So I started with a quote. And I said, to be Black and conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage. And that's from James Baldwin. And it really sort of conceptualized and put into context a lot of the things that we were seeing. I follow that up with the fact from Dr. Martin Luther King that said that riots and protests are the language of the voiceless, right? And I explained to her that a lot of these people were really, really upset and they didn't have an outlet. So what you see is sort of an eruption of people that have this frustration that had been built up and been building up for so long that it comes out in these outbursts like this. And I gave her a conversation about me, right? And to be transparent with all of you tonight, I had a real conversation with my daughter, right? I said, think about it like this. I am technically the great-great-grandson of a slave, right? My great-great-grandmother was a slave. And carrying this with me to know the fact that Brown is really not even my given name. That is the name of the man that owned my family. So I don't even know what my name is, right? So I carry this around with a lot of other African Americans in this country that have this sort of cognitive dissonance with who we are versus the name that we carry, right? And when you think about it from a standpoint of every other group in this country can trace their ancestry back, right? For African Americans in this country, our tracing stops at slavery. That's where it starts and that's where it ends for us. So we have this yearning and this wanting to know some things that will never probably be made available to us. And we carry this with us every day as a people, and it wears on you when you see the things that you see, and you have to walk through some of the microaggressions that we walk through on a daily basis and try to sometimes educate people on what they're seeing versus what they think that they're seeing from us. And a lot of times it gets hard, right? It becomes a struggle for us. And I ended our conversation in that car ride with a video. And I'm going to show you that video right after this. But my daughter and her 11-year-old mind, and as I showed her the video, which is what really broke my heart and really sort of drove me to really want to do this. But I realized at 11 years old, I saw a little bit of the light go out of her eyes, right? Because I know that now at 11 years old, some of her innocence has now been lost because she's seen some things that she can't unsee. And this is the world that she's now inheriting. And I have to, as her father, feel like this is my life's work that I'm handing over to her. And it wasn't an okay thing for me. So this is sort of this conversation that we're having. If we go to the next slide, Phil, about this whole thing of the impetus, right? And we've seen time and time again, you know, the Black Lives Matter, the All Lives Matter, and all the back and forth, and you see people trying to educate others on the misgivings of saying simply all lives matter. But the sad part is that even has to be a debate, right? We're not saying that Black Lives Matter more, Black Lives Matter most. It baffles my mind that we have to debate on just the fact that Black Lives matter. It's just matter. Not even something that's over the top. Can we just agree that they matter? And that is where a lot of this frustration comes from, you know. And if you go to the next slide, Phil, we go to that, and then you're carrying around this weight. You're carrying around all these things. And then this is the video that I sort of showed my daughter, and in her typical fashion, all that she said, well, that was traumatic. and that was just sort of how we left the conversation. But I wanted to share this with you and share exactly what I shared with my daughter, if you can't feel.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars
All right. We just wanted to, first off, let you kind of sit with that for a minute. I know that's, I've seen it 100 times, but I know for some of you, this may be the first time that you've seen it. So we wanted to allow you to kind of process what you just saw and take a moment before we move on to the next slide. So we'll pause briefly. Okay. With that, just sort of jumping back in and us talking about this being a moment or a movement. Over the years and historically, we've had a lot of moments, right? A moment, as you can see, is usually an emotionally charged event or ideology that quickly bursts onto the scene. But the issue typically is that they leave equally as quickly, right? There were issues and things that came up and events. For example, like the Jena 6 and the 6 teenagers in Jena, Louisiana, that created a moment where a lot of people were flying down to Jena, Louisiana, and they were protesting, and it led to people going to jail and arrests and the whole horror of it all. And then it was just that thing that we did once, right? There was the Occupy movement, Occupy Wall Street, Occupy this, Occupy that. And then it was, oh yeah, I remember that, right? The Tea Party movement, right? And they came, they burst onto the scene, everything was all things Tea Party, and then it was not, right? The Me Too movement, we don't know. That's why I put a question mark. Will that be a sustained movement, or will that end up being a moment? But one of the things that characterizes a movement, a moment from a movement, and as you can see, Joe Madison, who was a Hall of Fame broadcaster, made the statement that a movement has to cost you something. And the difference between a moment and a movement is sacrifice. And with every movement that's ever been a part of our history, there was enormous sacrifice. You talk about the people that gave their lives in the civil rights movement. There were people that were killed for trying to give Black people the right to vote. And they, no matter what, they did not stop until that was something that was the norm across the land, right? So there were certain things that had to happen to create these movements. And that is really what we're talking about tonight. Is this going to be something that people are willing to sacrifice for on the long term to create an actual movement? Or will this end up being just a moment? Now, when we talk about this issue, and you saw in our title, we talked a little bit about equity and inclusion. And the question becomes, what is it that we actually mean when we say these things? The issue with, you can go to the next one, Phil. The issue with this is the fact that when you really think of equity and inclusion, you're really talking about these being sort of the ideal, right? These are the ideal circumstances that we could find ourselves in. But the question that we're stuck with, and we have to walk through every day, is are these the actual, right? Is there actual equity, or is this something that we are continually striving for? Is this like Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Is this something that will sort of be us reaching self-actualization, or will this just be an ever-evolving thing that we're chasing? Right? That's the state of, or the quality of being just, impartial, and fair. You know, they're synonymous with fairness and justice. You hear a lot of times, especially synonymous with the social work profession, is social justice, right? And we will talk more about that tonight. But the other issue that we talk about is the systematic equity, you know, and that's a complex combination of interrelated elements and consciously designed aspects of this to create, support, and sustain social justice, right? And that's really the ideal. Those are things that we would love to see happen. And the question is, are those things actually happening in our current landscape? You know, a lot of people, depending upon who you ask, would beg to differ in various forms of fashion for the latter, or some that feel like this is actually already happening. So when you talk about inclusion, on the next slide, these are the same things. These are including and or being included within a group or a structure. You know, it sort of goes against a lot of the things that we see if you know anything about ethnocentrism and things like that. People are always in this situation of being an us and a them. And the us is always considered the in crowd. That them are typically outsiders, right? So when you talk about this inclusion, it's almost sort of baked into our society to create this us and this them. So how then do we get from this state of ethnocentrism to actually being inclusive and not having it simply be something that is done in deeds, but actually taken to heart and truly meant and felt? And those are the things that we're going to talk about tonight.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. And it is an absolute pleasure to see so many familiar faces, both from my students and colleagues. And so I want to say thank you for joining us tonight. What I'm going to do is, before I move into the content of my slides, I wanted to point out a couple of things, just a couple quick points. In times like this of social unrest, there often is a tension that exists within ourselves, within organizations, and even within the church. Individuals, organizations, we feel compelled to act, but often are conflicted or even like hesitant to engage in social movements. And the problem with that is it can lead to this sort of social paralysis that is damaging to the process of creating meaningful and lasting social change. So I want to recognize that some of you have come here tonight because you want to engage, but you're looking for new ideas on how to do so. Some of you are hesitant, but you're looking for either justice-oriented language or other perspectives to share within your circles. We know some of you are hurting, you know, you're angry, you're sad, you're anxious, you're concerned for your future or the future of your children. And so, you know, part of the message this evening is really to remind our fellow social workers, helping professionals, and Christians, right, that our obligations to respond in times of moral crisis are deeply rooted not only within our code of ethics, but in our spiritual beliefs, right? Our soul and our occupations can't afford to remain silent. And so, as I often say to students in my classes, social work is not a neutral profession. We don't have a luxury of maintaining our neutrality in a moral crisis. And so all of us collectively have reached a point, a moral impasse, if you will, where our faith now is called to align with our works. And so that's where we're taking things here. So Professor Bede, if you mind bringing up the first quote for me. I'd like to draw us in on this first quote here. This comes from Victor Hugo. If the soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but he who causes the darkness. I wanted to draw in on this particular quote because I'd like to emphasize for a moment that policy is not some distant notion left up to those in the higher rungs of government or politics. You know, policy is birthed, it's fostered, it's implemented, it's challenged within the community by people like you and me. So policy can create a darkness that consumes the individual serving within its systems, or it can bring a light of justice into the circles in which it's implemented. Us in the helping professions have a responsibility to engage where darkness is present. And so if individuals shape policy, right, which in turn shapes systems, the question sort of becomes, do our policies reflect Christ-centered values of equity, inclusion, and justice? We know that we're obligated for policy that promotes these values. And partially that's because what it's doing then is it's moving moments of inclusion, equity, and justice into a movement, right, of peace and social reconciliation. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to draw us in on a second quote now. This quote comes to us from Mother Teresa, right? Mother Teresa had said, "By blood I am Albanian, by citizenship I'm Indian, by faith I am a Catholic nun, as to the calling I belong to the world, as to my heart I belong entirely to Jesus." So Mother Teresa's policy, which we know was committed to a global obligation to addressing not only the poor's hunger for food, but for dignity, it was rooted in a deep and intimate relationship with Christ. And so as a result of that, the vine of Mother Teresa's policy, you know, for the poor, it grew from the seed of her faith and devotion for Christ, okay? And so let's take this concept that I just introduced and let's expand this, right, upon professionals, professional and spiritual obligations, right, to confront injustices, all right? And then we too, you know, should be guided by our faith. So what I want to do is I'm going to give you a partial framework here, all right, for addressing justice within a biblical context. Now, of course, there's a lot more that the Bible says about justice, right? But for the sake of today's conversation, I'm going to draw us in on 4. One is that we have been provided with a moral compass, right? In 1 John, we learn that let us not merely say that we love each other, let us know or show truth by our actions. So as Christians, we are called to live in deed and truth, aligning our actions with the morality of Christ-centered justice. In essence, really, any social movement that's absent from a centric focus on Christ's teachings really doesn't have the potential to continue on as a movement. And so we know that this second lesson that we've learned from Scripture is that our faith must align with our works, right? So faith is a conviction, it's a feeling that we have, but according to Scripture, it's also made visible by action. It's not enough to say that we support all Black Lives Matter, right? Black Lives Matter. It's not enough to just want to be an accomplice. We have to actually put our words into action. So our individual and collective deeds, including policy, are dead without the presence of our faith, right? I want to draw us in on a third lesson, and that's this notion of bondage, right? And so ignorance in particular, what we learn from Scripture, leads to mental and spiritual bondage, right? And so we learned, as Jesus said, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So ignorance, right, promotes injustice. When we are ignorant about social policy, it validates our neutrality. It disempowers the oppressed, and it enslaves the oppressor as well through sin, okay? And finally, the last lesson I wanted to draw us into and related to Scripture and justice is this notion of forgiveness, right? One of Jesus' final acts on the cross was literally an act of forgiveness. We know these lines of forgive them, Father, for they do not know what they are doing. They are ignorant, right? And so in this notion, Jesus could have called for retribution. Jesus could have called for anger. And what Jesus did was say, forgive. But forgiveness then was an action-oriented word. He moved us into action to forgive. So forgiveness really, when we look at its core, is a Christ-centered policy that moves to stamp out ignorance. When we forgive, not only are we saying that we're sorry, but what we are doing is we are acknowledging an injustice that has occurred. We act to pursue shalom, or what we discuss as that balance via equitable policy and programs. All right, so these are those 4 biblical themes I wanted to draw our attention on. Professor B, thank you. You can go ahead and bring in the next slide. So what I want to do now is just give a brief, very brief sort of example of how this looks in action, right? So when our policy from a Christ-centered heart for justice, right, is enacted, we see moments now transform into movements. So I'd like to take a moment to just briefly highlight some areas in which Reverend King rooted and aligned the civil rights movement with his faith. So Reverend King deliberately created a series of what we would call moments that called attention to systemic injustices that were occurring, while simultaneously advocating for policy that would shift these moments into a movement, okay? So if we look at this first scripture verse from Genesis, Dr. King based the entire movement of the civil rights movement in the 60s based off the fact that every human being is a child of God and made in his image and therefore possesses God-given dignity. So this was the foundation of this movement. Now, there's a sermon delivered in 1967, I believe, referred to as the Knock at Midnight, where what Dr. King did was specifically call for social policy to combat the darkness of the current social order. What King was really doing here was he was saying that policy and its application of power must provide both the oppressed with hope, quality, but also just systems and programs to undergird those values. So remember, it's not just about saying that we want action, it's about making sure that there's accountability in place with our systems. Ignorance, in regards to mental and spiritual bondage, King called for a two-pronged approach to our modality of thinking. So King called for us to abandon this either-or thought, that it could be either education or legislation. And what he advocated for was that social change had to adopt a both and approach, that it could be both education and legislation in order to convert moments into movements. And so what King called for was that demonstrations and policy had to be advanced in order to create meaningful and lasting change within society. And finally, this last point that I want to drive home, a famous line from one of King's sermons. Again, he emphasized darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And so what King was calling for was a Christ-centered policy in an action-oriented plea for forgiveness, that we could literally create policy that pleads for forgiveness, establishing formal systems of programs that promote equity, inclusion, but also restoration and reparations for those who have been oppressed. All right, so that's just a quick little outline of what King moved for aligned with his faith, okay? So here's what I'd like to be able to do. So all of this that we've been talking about are moments, right, that we are hoping and praying converts into a social movement that includes equity and inclusion and justice, right? So I do want to highlight a quick case analysis. And what I'd like to be able to do is provide just a brief case analysis examining the death of Trayvon Martin and the policy which led to the acquittal of his killer, George Zimmerman. And the reason why I want to do that is because that was a moment that still remains active, waiting to become a movement. So I'd like to highlight the facts of the case. So here are the facts of the case. On February 26, 2012 in Sanford, Florida, Trayvon Martin, who was 17 at the time, and George Zimmerman, 28, were involved in a physical altercation resulting in Martin being shot once in his chest and as a result dying of his wounds. A focus at this time, national attention was placed particularly on Florida's stand your ground law, particularly in two arenas. One, the notion of duty to retreat, and the second was the criterion that was required to sustain what we believe was self-defense in the state of Florida. So a microscope was placed on this particular policy. Now, through the stand your ground law was not invoked in this case specifically, jurors did receive instruction to consider evidence under the definition of self-defense in Florida, which was shaped by stand your ground policy. So let's take an examination of this, okay? I want to take a moment to briefly highlight 3 areas of stand your ground law in Florida. The reason I want to do this is because this sets the tone, if you will, for the jurors' instructions to weigh the letter of the law with the evidence that was presented. In other words, this is where policy, rubber meets the road, okay? This is where it's going to be applied. If you notice in section 1 here, under Florida stand your ground, a person has no duty to retreat and has a right to stand his or her own ground. What that calls for essentially is if a person feels that they are being threatened, then what can happen is they can engage with that threat and they have no duty to attempt to remove themselves from the situation first. Legally, they are justified in engaging. Now, if you look at section 1B, stand your ground law states deadly force is permissible if he or she reasonably believes that using a threatening to use such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm. And finally, under section 2B here, all right, lethal force is actually legal if the individual had reason to believe that unlawful and forcible entry or unlawful and forcible acts were occurring or had occurred. Okay, so the verbiage highlighted here in this slide set the tone for arguments presented in court and for jurors to consider how to apply the law. So Dr. B, can we move on to the next slide? So we know the outcomes of this, correct? We know the outcome of Trayvon Martin's case. According to the evidence provided in the case, Zimmerman's arrest was legally delayed. And some folks were asking the question, why is it taking so long to arrest George Zimmerman? Well, the reason is that the policy, the law that was written in place said that upon initial presentation of the evidence, if there was not enough evidence to discuss or to present that the stand your ground law was not applicable in this case, that George Zimmerman acted outside of that, then an arrest was warranted. But in this case, we only had one story. So because only one side of the story was shared, which was Zimmerman's, the jury deliberated on the evidence that was provided, what they had under the guidelines of Florida's policy. And on July 13th, we know that Zimmerman was acquitted of all charges, including second-degree murder and manslaughter in the state of Florida. So this moment that occurred, painful as it was, revealed an unjust policy that left unchallenged and unrevised, still permits future racially biased murders to take place. Protected, in fact, right, and justified by self-defense policies as they stand. Now, what's also important to note here, Professor B, if you don't mind, is that similar stand your ground policies exist in 27 states throughout our country. All right, so, and I think the last point, without concerted methods and demonstrations and policy here, this cycle has, this door is left open to perpetuate. And so this is the notion of this call to action that we are engaging in, right? That there can't be a differentiation between our faith and our actions, right? So if an individual can be deemed as not guilty in our country, that doesn't necessarily mean that the crime that they committed, that they were innocent in that crime. So the law needs to equate to justice. All right, I'm gonna hand this over now to Professor B and
Wow.
Dr. Brown.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mexico. And again, thank you also to Dr. Brown. Dr. Brown's going to be joining me in this next section. We're going to try to engage in some dialogue around some theories and concepts in terms of policy development and some identifying underlying dynamics as policy is developed. And we're going to walk through 4 of these kind of theories. So first one is rationalism. The idea of developing policy from the standpoint of rationalism would be to take in every point of view possible, to take in everyone's values, to incorporate or to hear from everyone's perspective, and to try to incorporate that in to the development of a policy. And so maybe ideal, but maybe not necessarily always realistic. And so what often happens with public policy is a concept of incrementalism, in which policy is put forward through legislation and other methods, which we'll talk about later, and then it's analyzed, and then what happens is maybe there are identified unintended consequences, and then we incrementally amend or expand or even abolish parts of that policy as time goes on. Sometimes that time period, that window of incrementalism can happen over a long period of time. And sometimes, like in the fact of COVID, incrementalism can happen very, very quickly. Within days, they could be advancing continued public policy. And then we have this concept of a window of opportunity. Certainly with COVID, we saw a window of opportunity. We saw it in 2018 with the omnibus bill. We saw it with the opioid epidemic, and I think now we're seeing it just yesterday revealed a window of opportunity in which policy and legislation was introduced because of this window of opportunity here of what happened with the killing of George Floyd. But what also happens oftentimes with the window of opportunity legislation is this is oftentimes policies or legislation or finance initiatives that have been backburnered, that have been written and they've been sitting on the table for someone, and it's an opportunity just to throw them all together and then rush them through without maybe making large reform that really is called for, and thus sometimes leaving us just with a moment in terms of policymaking, versus then having a magnitude in policymaking, which when there's a major event, like a movement that's beginning to happen here in America, which allows for major reform to take place. And it's happened before in our country, and it's possible to happen here. But for magnitude and for real justice and real reform to take place means that there may need to be some additional time and discussion to be thoughtful about how to impactfully create social justice. So when we talk about creating social policy, there are lots of different ways to do that clearly. And there's a couple ways that we want. Clearly, legislative action, which has begun to happen not only at the federal level, but across many states across the country. Clearly, executive orders from the president and governors and local officials, advocacy groups, and of course, campaigns and others, tribal governance. But we wanted to talk about campaigns a bit because this is, again, where, as Dr. Mahika was saying, we have a call to action as ourselves, and who we elect into office, when we show up to the polls, we personally affect policy that way. And I'm going to give it over to my brother, Dr. Brown.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. One of the things that we've discussed ad nauseum is, for lack of a better word, the general public's ignorance as it pertains to local politics. And one of the classic and probably best examples to illustrate this is the election of President Barack Obama. This was a day that was marked with a lot of pride, a lot of optimism for the future, and America was standing on the precipice of change. At least that is what everyone was feeling and thinking, and that was the sentiment around the country and honestly around the world, right? You see to the left, there were tears of joy from a lot of people that felt that this was really a monumental movement. But the question becomes, was this really a movement, or did it simply end up being a moment? And the reason that we question this and we call this a moment was what happened immediately afterwards, right? So the next slide, if you take a look at this. So we had probably one of the biggest turnouts in American history in terms of our national election for president, right? So we had these people that came out that had probably never voted before in their lives, and we had lines around the corner. People were willing to wait. People did what they had to do to make sure that their vote counted. But what ended up happening is just a couple of years later, the voter turnout for congressional elections was at 28%. This is according to the Press Enterprise, right? In Riverside County alone, our 2018 election results were 19.63%, right? So what ended up happening was, and you hear people say, President Obama didn't do anything. He wasn't able to get anything done. That was a waste of 8 years. But how could he, right? So what you ended up with was a Democratic president with an all-Republican House and Senate who were basically telling you what was going to happen from the very beginning. When you had Senator McConnell that said that my job is to make you a one-term president. So they became the party of no. So anything that he was trying to do was going to be denied, right? So you created this situation where people were expecting change, as you can see, but there was no apparatus in place to actually bring this change about. Why? It wasn't the president, it was us. Because we failed to show up at the polls when he needed us, we weren't there for him, right? So we expected him to make a change that he wasn't equipped to make, right? So those were the kinds of things that created this perfect storm for almost nothingness, right? So he had 8 years of battling back and forth and going against this insurmountable object and its immovable object that we helped to create, in a sense. If you could go to the next slide. So what we ended up talking about was this whole thing of policy development and having this conversation of things that are happening about me without me, right? And this level of our ignorance, I think, is probably nowhere does it show our lack of informed knowledge about our process and our political process than what happened in Nevada in 2018. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but in 2018, in Nevada, there was a dead man that was elected to assembly. He passed away. He literally passed away before the election, and no one knew. Despite all of the notices that said that this man was not even alive, he still got 63% of the vote, right? Just on name recognition alone, right? So they came out, saw the name, registered with them. Oh yeah, I know him. That's who I'm voting for. So they had to undo sort of what we had done as a people by going out and voting for essentially a man that had already deceased, right? But those are the kinds of things that sort of speak to the level of, I hate throwing that word ignorance around, but yeah, ignorance, because there's no other way to explain it. But when you're talking about this whole aspect of policy development, one of the things that's critical for policy development is having the right people at the table, right? Some of the things that we talked about that don't happen enough to really matter are the things like environmental scanning, right? Do we know what makes up our neighborhoods and our communities? Are we having town halls? Are we finding out the key decision makers? Are we knowledgeable about the people that are in the communities and their actual needs, right? Because I know as a social worker for years, I was never at the table. I don't know who would come up with these policies, but those would be the policies that we were left to kind of carry out, where the people that were actually developing these policies would probably never carry the case, right? And say, oh yeah, you guys can handle 100 cases in children's services, right? Yeah, go ahead. Right? But that was what we were left to do because we weren't at the table. And I didn't understand it then, but I definitely understand how much of a need it is for us now, right? And I talked about the community focus groups. The other issue is doing a SWOT analysis. When you're looking at any kind of policy development and any kind of policy implementation, you want to look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, right? How do those things play out in a community setting? Who are your allies, as Dr. Hayes and Professor Dr. Costello talked about in their presentation last week, and your advocates? Who are those people, right? So that you can find out who can help you move your initiatives forward, but also who might stand in your way. So, and that is where that SWOT analysis comes from. You can go on to the next one now. I think this one is Phil.
You want me to jump in on this? Yeah. So, so you were leaving it right there for me, Dr. Brown, in which, not only oftentimes are the right people not at the table when policy is developed, and then it's carried out, but at the end of the day too, and we're speaking right now really to social workers, is that and any of my students in this class know this very well, this idea of a street level bureaucrat who maybe has the most influence of how a policy is carried out. And I think that we've seen videos of that. Dr. Brown showed a video earlier in our discussion in which there were probably a lot of policy violations, if not legal and ethical violations in that video, right? And yet the street level bureaucrat has so much influence and discretion on how certain policies carried out. And so it's important for us to really not only develop policy that's just and fair, but then also be able to develop a delivery system in which maintains that fairness and that justice. And before I move on, Dr. Brown, did you want to comment anything else on this slide?
No, you're fine. You can.
Okay, we're going to keep going.
Yes, sir.
So I'm going to go through some research. As I talked about, I had the opportunity to conduct some research with a colleague of mine, Russ Bermejo. We looked at the idea of disproportionality and disparities in the child welfare system. And specifically, we wanted to look at were there any disproportionality or disparities in an evidence-based program called Family Treatment Court, which involves the child welfare system and the justice system and the treatment systems partnering together for families. And I know we're running late on time, so I'm going to go through this really quickly. This was the article. We started with 18 communities. Unfortunately, many of those communities didn't have the data that was quality enough for us to keep them in our study, which is another lesson that I'll point to later, the importance of good quality data. But in this study, we had 3,500 children that we looked at, that we studied, kind of longitudinal. It was over a 5-year period. And so before I jump into the findings, I just want to make sure that I define these terms. So when we talk about disproportionality, in a sense, what we're talking about is the underrepresentation or the overrepresentation in a program. So looking at our justice systems and our child welfare systems, we often see overrepresentation of minority groups. And what we were concerned with specifically is, did we see underrepresentation of these same groups, specifically African-American children and families and American Indian children and families? Were they underrepresented in evidence-based, high-quality programming or not? Second thing is looking at disparity. When we talk about disparity, we're really talking about unequal outcomes. So does that leave us then with maybe getting similar type of services, but outcomes are not equal for certain groups of people? And we wanted to spend some time looking at this. Did children stay in foster care longer? Did they exit to reunification at less rates? Those type of outcomes in programming. And so we took a look at that. And then after we looked at the findings from these 18 communities across the country, later left with 11, that's not where we wanted to stop, because we did find that in some communities, we saw better outcomes or at least equal outcomes, and we did not see disproportionality. So we saw equity and inclusion in certain communities, and we came with 5 things that social service programs or social policy can do to be equitable and more inclusive with their programming. So the first is that they have to be intentional. So if it's not purposeful, if it's not intentional that we're looking at equity and inclusion, and it can't just be a throwaway line, a disclaimer, we're against discrimination, that's not intentional. But in the case of Seattle, Washington, King County, it's the second stated goal of their programs in King County, Washington. When they look and they revisit, what is the goal of our program? It's equity and inclusion. Second thing that we can do is collect key data to examine disproportionality and disparity. And this has to be nuanced data. And I know that data isn't everybody's thing. They want to do that. But without data, there's another term we like to use. If you can't count it, you can't fix it. And so again, out of those 18 communities, we could only keep 11 in our study because they had good enough data for us to even know what was happening in those communities. So if you're not collecting data and looking at that data, using that data, you can't begin to address the inequities in a program. There must be systematic instruments developed. And where we found what the importance of systematic is because of the bureaucratic street level leadership. If it's relational, if it's interpersonal, if it's not validated, reliable, and systematic, it leads to maybe unintentional or intentional disparities and disproportionality. A fourth thing is that it needs to be inclusive. Dr. Brown used the term, nothing about me without me. So we say, ask the experts, who do they think are, what do they think the right solutions are? So go to the community and be inclusive that way. And the last thing is there has to be, at the end of all of this, the team, in other words, the professionals implementing the policy must be engaged in team training to address cultural humility, to address implicit biases, to understand how to read data, to understand how to be systemic. And so these are the 5 things that we came away with in that study. And we need that professional training so that we can also raise the level of accountability for our teams, so that we can hold us accountable to our professional standards, that we're constantly looking for quality improvement. And if incremental continued policy improvements are needed, then we need to be doing that. And there's other built into the systems places where those can happen if they're used as tools and not just simply as processes that we throw away because we're just searching for the money. Turn it back to Dr. Brown.
We would be remiss if we touched on this subject and didn't deal with the issue of implicit bias, right? And really talking about some of the things that we see, but sometimes we don't see, right? As you can see, implicit bias is a set of attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So what we're really talking about is things that are happening and behaviors even that we might exhibit that we're not even aware that we're exhibiting, right? And we talk about, in social work, there's a need for self-awareness, right? We're talking about, in class, and we got our students in here, we're always talking about, hey, is this my stuff before I speak, is this my stuff or is this something else, right? And we are forced to do the work on ourselves because we don't want to be in a situation where we're doing a disservice to a client, right? Where we are putting our own value systems out on our clients and having our fears put and placed upon them, right? And we're not having any transference and counter-transference issues that are happening, and we have to be aware of our stuff. But one of the things that happens that we've been made keenly aware of is that even in us doing all of this work, we're doing this, and we're just doing this for therapy and for social work practice purposes. And the issue is we don't carry guns. There are whole police departments that haven't even touched on some of this work, and they're making life and death decisions on the streets on situations that they're not even aware that they are even experiencing or feeling about certain groups of people, right? So we're talking about, and what we will move into in this next phase is talking about some next steps, because my mind is always solution focused, and sort of when you talk about this movement or this moment, I'm always focused on, we've had all of these moments, but now what, right? Because if there aren't any intentional policy implementation practices moving forward, if we aren't intentional about things that, we always talk about the reactive parts of social welfare policy, so that henceforth and forevermore these things don't ever happen again, then they will keep happening, as we can see, right? So I wanted to leave you guys tonight with this quote: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever truly has." And that's by Margaret Mead. And with that, folks, we wanted to stop and move to our other phase of next steps, and really allowing, we've talked enough, and we have some experts in this room, and we would be remiss if we didn't reach out to the expertise that's in this room and allow them an opportunity to share with us so that we can all learn and grow as we begin to take our next steps in this process. So with that, I'll open it up to you guys. Dr. Mayiko, did you want to lead this session or this portion? I believe we talked about that.
Sure. So one of the things that we wanted to do was maintain this solution-focused approach to the conversation. I know a few of you have questions. So what we could do is, maybe what I'd like to do is be able to field some of the attendees' questions, and we can decide who to lob those back and forth with, and keeping in mind some of these 3 questions that are presented here. So if you want, we can open up for some questions at this time. And Jasmine, I think you had a question too.
And make sure to unmute yourself. Let me see.
Oh, Jasmine's trying to unmute herself there.
Let me try. I'll see if I can help.
Yes, I'll address. There's a question here about whether or not this recording will be available. So yes, give us just a few days to maybe a week or so for us to be able to move this recording onto our MSW YouTube channel, and then that'll be distributed through Lindsay and through other mechanisms, also probably links through social media. So if you follow us on social media, you should be able to get those links. So we're going to go ahead and allow you to unmute yourself. But if you're not speaking, it would be best if you could mute your own self so that we don't get a lot of background echo. So let's open it up for a few minutes. We know we've gone over time, but we think we're just started a conversation. We want to allow some questions here. So, okay. All right, let's go with Jasmine first. Go ahead, are you able to unmute you? I think.
Cool. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So I've been very surprised at a lot of my brothers in Christ responses to this. So I started asking myself why. Why are we taking such a passive approach? And I started doing some research on the conservative end of what this looks like, because I really think that as social workers, we really have to be open to every theory. So some things that I came across, and it surprised me, and I honestly don't know how to go about it, are the stats, right? So from what I've seen, the Conservative Party prides themselves on the facts, or acknowledging what fake news is or what fake media is. So some responses that I've gotten is that 9 unarmed shootings happened last year. Sorry, not 9, but 9 black unarmed shootings happened last year. 19 were white and 18 were Latino. And then there's this like focus on black crime, that 70% of homicides in Chicago are specifically black on black. And then there was this other data set that talked about 960 shootings happened by black cops, and that 4% of those cops were white that shot unarmed black men. And then there's this whole challenging the idea of systemic racism, that it can be falsifiable, we can't run experiments on it or observational studies, therefore that theory isn't, they don't believe that theory at all. And then there's this other idea of the reason why there's so much crime or black on black violence, or even just encounters with the police, is because of fatherless homes. So it's not so much a systemic issue, but it's coming because of these fatherless homes. And then even further than that, this idea or this notion stating that child welfare programs makes these families lazy. So it doesn't help with, making or helping these families become more individualized. And I don't know if you guys have heard of Candace Owens, but she something. She said, phrases like white privilege are just a modern twist on white supremacist ideology. Asking me to believe in white privilege means asking me to accept black inferiority. To the person, to look at a white person and recognize that I am less than them in the world, how about no? So I'm coming across all these things and I'm like, wow, like, this is like, I've learned, systematic racism, implicit bias for 2 years. And there's this, Christian population of people who have all these stats and all these ideas. And it's like, well, how do we have a conversation with them? So I know that's a lot of information, but how do we have a conversation with them is my question, I guess.
Anybody want to?
Go. I was just going to start with this. Thanks, Jasmine, for your comments there. And, as faculty, we've had a conversation similar to that, and that our concern about people twisting scripture, for instance, into something else. And we want to make, and so I appreciate Dr. Mexico's words today, and that directs us back to the unity and the love into the social justice and the equity and the fairness that Jesus points us to. So, Dr. Brown, you want to add, or Dr. Miko?
Yeah, I will. Dr. Mako, did you want to jump in first?
I think the one small point to make, and I think to Jasmine's question is that, and I think also the points that she iterated is there's so much information coming from multiple angles that it's easy to become overwhelmed. And like I said, it leads to that paralysis, right? And so the question here then becomes, how do we move forward? How do we take first steps? Part of that is we have to have the courage to engage in these conversations. The fact that you all are sitting here, you know, on an evening where it's dinner time and you're willing to engage in this is what we need to continue to do. And when I mean engage in discussion, I don't mean the yelling and screaming or the blaming. I mean truly an attempt to understand the perspective of others and to ask folks to listen to ours as well. And so I think the first step to this is we can't allow it to sit in silence. And we've learned from Dr. King that he taught that time is neutral. So the longer that we stay paralyzed and we don't engage in discussion, the other side's using it to move forward with their agenda. They're going to continue moving on. So it's important to us to engage.
Just adding a little piece to that, and what I'll say, Jasmine, is the one thing that you always want to do is do your own research, because a lot of the things that we're bombarded with in the media are kind of like half truths, right? A lot of the things that you see are very nuanced. So there are things that you will push to the forefront to say, well, look at this, right? You'll hear certain talking points, like you said, black on black crime. And if I had a nickel for every time somebody brought up Chicago has nothing to do with George Floyd being choked to death for 9 minutes, but that is the talking point that'll be inserted into any argument because it's one that I guess fits the narrative that you'll see. But the question becomes, how accurate is it? And that is what we talk about, right? Because there are a variety of different things that create the landscape that we see, right? So if you fast forward to 2020 and you never look at the history of how things came to be, then yeah, I guess that is true, right? But if you look at the housing discrimination, you look at hiring discrimination, you look at all the things that created the landscape that people have been asked to live in, a lot of the things that people do make a lot more sense, right? When you talk about a lot of these things, when you look at the crime or air quote crime that you see in a lot of these communities of color, a lot of it has to do with the fact that they are policed more so than some of these other areas, right? I might not see, living around the corner here, I might not see a cop all day, right? But if I go to some other areas in the Inland Empire, it's cops on every corner, right? So just by the physical proximity and the larger numbers of police that are in designated areas, people have more contact. More contact with police leads to more arrests, leads to more of a lot of the things that happen, and it sort of skews the data a little bit. So you can take that data as a black and white point and say, well, yeah, see, this is proof that blacks commit more crimes. No, they just have more contact with the police. So it's not an evidence of a crime. And then just the fact that they have the contact, we can go down a whole nother road with the criminal justice system and talk about the fact that half of these people are in there for crimes that they probably didn't commit and just don't have the money for a proper legal defense, right? And they're asked to take a plea and ask for all these other things. So, you know, if you look at things like 13th by Ava DuVernay, will give you some insight into the prison industrial complex and a lot of the things that are at play that you see, but those aren't brought up. You won't hear those things. Nobody will bring that up, but they'll just throw you statistics about evidence that proves their point that, see, blacks commit more crimes, but it's a lot more nuanced than that.
I think Ryan had a question that we were going to address next, and then I wanted to follow up with a comment. Gabe, you had a question as well, so I want to make sure I comment on that too. Ryan, did you want to ask your question? All right. While Ryan is maybe unmuting, I wanted to also respond. Gabe, you had a question in reference to, it's good to see you here too, by the way, Gabe. So I'm glad you're here. So you had a question related to Georgia, that you know, whether or not it has stand your ground law, and will that apply in the case of Ahmaud Arbery? So I think that's an excellent question to have. I think the first step would be is that without me being an attorney, being an expert in all the stand your ground laws in those 27 states, I think first we have an obligation to start diving into the letter of that law, similar to what we did here in Florida. There are statutes related to stand your ground law that call for that law to be invoked and applied to a particular case. And then there's a series of steps that fall with that. What's going to happen here is the defense are going to have to determine whether or not it's going to be to their advantage in court to call and invoke that law into place. Also, we need to know the nuances of what is permissible in Georgia that constitutes self-defense. Probably don't imagine it being too much different from what was in Florida, but I would have to see that. The other piece to keep in mind is that bigger picture, right? So if we're going to have stand your ground laws throughout 27 states and they open a door for discriminatory killings, all right, that are going to be justified in court, and that's a larger battle in terms of policy that we need to be prepared to address related to other factors in this country that are sensitive issues to discuss. So again, not shying away from these discussions, but continuing to confront, right, and ask questions about why. Why is this allowed to perpetuate?
Okay, I think Ryan's ready also.
Yes, I'm here now.
Hey, Ryan.
Hi, how are you doing, Dr. Brown?
Good. Welcome. Welcome.
Good. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm glad I was able to jump on. I think a lot of times right now, I see people in the comments talking about, you know, the safe spaces that we need to create for students, just to make them, you know, understand that they do have a voice and that their voice can be heard on a multitude of platforms, right? Not just social media with people who agree or disagree with them, but also that they're being heard by higher admins, because I've worked in education for about 7 years now, and I'm still very young, so I started young. And so I've always known the power in numbers and the power in student voice. And so a lot of the conversation that I see happening around Cal State's, UC's a little bit, but mostly Cal State's, because just for whatever reason, those attract maybe some more vocal students. I'm not too sure, but I have seen a lot more private schools stepping in because maybe they have a little bit more agency over whether or not that they can hold these types of public forums. I've seen a lot of very broad statements put out by the CSU system, just basically saying they don't really want to touch this situation. They would rather stay, you know, in this kind of neutral space, right? Which we know that this does not exist. There's no way to be neutral when students feel that they're being unheard. You either agree with them or you disagree with them. And so I find myself a lot of times on platforms trying to allow students the time and space to voice their opinions, but they're still very silenced because they're like, okay, well, we can hold a community meeting, we can hold, a Zoom meeting or something like this, but they don't feel as though their points are really being amounted to anything. And so what I would ask you is, how do you go about making your concern and your support for the movements that are important, right? And talking about issues around community policing and kind of breaking down the stigma, right? Understanding that it's not just, you know, your next door neighbor kind of with binoculars, right? Like there's actual steps that can be made to make a lasting impact, right? We don't necessarily need, people with badges that feel like they're above the law and feel like they are now the judge and jury of people's lives, right? And so my question would be, how have you maybe found your voice in working for the school system, and how do you try to use your voice to encourage younger folk that don't necessarily understand that there is power in numbers?
Great question. First off, I wanted to make sure we gave a shout out to Dr. Gustafson, who is our dean, that is giving up her evening to hang out with us a little bit tonight. So those are, we talk about some of the things that we're able to do. I appreciate her for being intentional about allowing this space for things like this, right? Because this could have very easily have been shut down and said, well, this isn't the time or the space. Maybe it's a little too controversial right now. Let's wait. And I think a moment would have been lost, right? So when you talk about those things, you have to think about the people that are in place and the opportunities that they choose to seize, like this for us, right? Because this started from a conversation. And I appreciate both Dr. Lee Johnson and Dr. Gustafson being nimble enough to allow us to kind of shift this whole narrative, because this was I think Professor Breitenbuscher can attest to the fact this was a different presentation 6 days ago, right? And this was something that we developed just in response to what it is that we were seeing and experiencing, right? And we wanted to bring this for not only students, but for faculty. And we wanted to have community folks like yourself that could come in and shine some light on that. So those are the things that we start with, but like anything else, that's just a start. And it can't end there. But this is where we definitely wanted to begin the process, but it will hopefully, and with anything that we have to do with it, will move to some spaces that will allow for even more and further discussion on these critical topics.
Okay, it looks like
Elizabeth.
Sarah Garner has a question. And then I see right after that, it looks like Elizabeth.
Okay, I can't get my video to turn on, but for one, just wanted to start by saying thank you. It was really cool to be back in an environment, learning from all of you again, the faculty at CVU. Really cool to see some of your guys' faces again. It's been a while. But okay, mine's kind of taking a little bit more so off of what Dr. Mexico said about the combination of taking both, I think he said education and policy when we're talking about Martin Luther King Jr. I have taken kind of my, how do I explain this? I focus all my work in correctional mental health. I've worked in detention. I currently work in a prison. I work with the offenders day in and day out. I get the chance to get to know them, their backstory, their biopsychosocial. And sometimes I'm like, really makes sense how you got here, right? But then on the other side, I still feel apprehensive to this idea of dismantling and defunding police. And I understand that some of what I'm reading is that really radical, like fear mongering of, well, it's just going to be a social worker responding. And as much as I work with these guys, I don't think I want to be on the front line when they're in a psychotic episode or under the influence of something, being like, whoa, calm down. My job is secure because I'm in a very controlled environment. So my question really comes down to, like, Dr. Lee Johnson, you could probably just knock this one out of the park for me. Where do I start to educate myself on this? How do I start to alleviate some of the fear? How do I start to be able to better educate when people are like, well, here's what to expect. We're only going to have people community policing.
All right, so I was trying to vow myself to silence in all of these sessions, but now you've willed me in. So I think that it can't be an either or. And I think that's what Dr. Mexico was lending to earlier, is that it has to be a both and. And that's what Dr. King was dealing with. So is the answer completely defunding police officers? No, that's not the complete answer, but it is part of the answer. The reality is that, do you want law enforcement to be the first line of defense for what's going on in our communities? Probably not. That's not their training. The training is to subdue and to handle situations that are beyond control. Who should be on the first line? Really are social workers. Because if somebody is having a mental health episode, you're coming with a different set of skills versus a baton, a taser, a gun that escalates a situation to the next level. So we're talking about, Meek Mill said there's levels to this, right? There's levels to this game. And what we're doing is that we're putting people to deal with folks who are in crisis, right, at the wrong point of the continuum. So it's about us evaluating our process of how we examine people. The other part of it, Sarah, is to not only look at folks when they're in their situation, but to also examine the roots of what created situations. And that's what we miss. We often are, our eyes are on the symptoms, okay, but not the causes of what's creating it. And until we get there, it becomes like coronavirus. You know, until I can do some contact tracing, until I can get down to where this is actually coming from, what causes this, then I can walk around a whole lot of people who are asymptomatic and they are passing it on to me. I didn't recognize that they were infected, but now they're infecting me because I've never dealt with the root of what's there. So I don't want to go too deep into that territory, but I hope there's a little bit of help there of why the conversation has gone to the extreme of defunding. Now, examples, Camden, New Jersey, they had a situation where they defunded the entire police department. And what happened in Camden? Police crime or crime period in Camden dropped by nearly 40%. Now that's 7 years ago. That doesn't mean that they don't have a police force, they do, but they got rid of everybody that was there because it was so corrupt. And we may be looking at a situation like that in many of our police departments where the corruption is so rampant that we almost need a do-over.
I just want to add to my experience in working with justice teams that Dr. Mexico spoke to this in his words, of the importance of addressing ignorance. I have seen police chiefs, police captains, sheriffs, county sheriff, turn a complete different perspective through education, specifically related to how their officers are responding to people with a substance use disorder and a mental health disorder, where before they would respond with handcuffs and batons, and now they respond with overdose medication and referrals to treatment. And so, you know, we have a long way to go. This has to be unpacked in so many ways, but we had a slide we were going to end on. There is hope. If we point to the research, I think Dr. Flores Carter made a comment. There needs to be so much more research done in these areas to understand really how to transform the justice system in a way that's equitable. And there's pieces of it out there, but we have a long way to go. I want to just point us to that 6:30, and I think at the top I thought we could stop at 6. There's no way we could, but I want to keep us somewhat respectful of time and let us go to at least till 6:30 if that's okay with folks. I do want to, I need to do a quick plug real quick, and Dr. Brown's going to help me on this. This program is, can only be available to you right now. Well, not only available to you, but programs like this can be available, and we can assist current social workers or MSW students and future MSW students through active alumni. And so we want to encourage you to get engaged with us as alumni, stay connected with us. And one way today that you can join this conversation is you can donate. You can donate to the MSW Alumni Fund. And we have some specific instructions that I think Dr. Brown might be able to paste into the chat or walk you through. But you know, how you give of your talents, how you give of your your funds really speaks to your values and your priorities. And so we just want to again encourage you to do that. The better we can do as an MSW program only heightens the level of your MSW degree here at CBU. So you know, I had to do that plug. Dr. Thornton is in charge of that. She couldn't be here tonight, so I stepped in for her there.
Well said. Well said. I think Ryan had one quick comment. If you're still there, I saw it in the chat.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to the young lady who had just spoken about basically being first responders and not necessarily loving that idea for social workers, because I definitely understand that. I feel like a lot of people, you know, I'm a teacher myself, and when we have, students that are just, not necessarily getting the best out of their home life. And when they come in, you know, they bring all their issues and trauma right into our classroom, right? And we've seen, if you're familiar with a few instances where it's made headline news because they've had to put a student in handcuffs, right? They've, for whatever reason, you know, with there maybe not being a counselor or therapist available, whatever the case, this student, you know, as young as 6 years old has been put in the back of a cop car, right? So what kind of trauma comes with, you know, being in the cop car as, you know, as a young person, right? And so I just would like to urge people to understand that defunding police also means putting that money back into other resources that really can prevent a lot of the crimes that we think are that just kind of happen just because, right? A lot of the crime, you want to talk about things that are happening as far as looting and all those things. We see that from a bird's eye view, right? We're not looking at it as, you know, the macro level, right? Why do people feel the need to loot, right? Why do people feel so destitute that they need to go into a broken window and steal things? And so I think we just need to remember that defunding doesn't necessarily mean everybody else just doesn't get the money. No, those same communities are just poured into with social workers at the front lines before the crisis, right? Not necessarily needing the crisis counselors because you are stepping in well before those issues create, you know, some type of imbalance or scary situation. So I would just like to encourage people, when we start talking about defunding the police, we're already starting the conversation from the midpoint. And if you go before that and you think of a proactive way to use that money instead of just giving it to police with, you know, batons, tasers, and etc., right? Their training is completely different. We have to remember that that money will be poured into that community so that they will prevent a lot of those things from happening, right? It's not just single parents. Everybody needs help. It takes a village to raise everyone. So I just encourage people to do research on what the reality is and what it could look like to defund, but also refund the community on what they've been so lost on. So that's all. Thank you, though. I appreciate the platform.
And if you want to point to a parallel, so look at the child welfare system. In 2018, the Family First Prevention Services Act was passed, which is completely reimagines and reforms the child welfare system in ways that people would have never have thought possible. The analogy was that the way the child welfare system is built currently is if we addressed polio by just handing out crutches. We waited for people to get sick and to have a disability, and then we gave them crutches. Is the way the system is currently operating. And Family First flips that instead and says, let's pour the money into prevention so that we don't have to, so families don't have to engage in the trauma of removal. And so again, I think if we can point to studies like that, if we can point to sample legislation of how we flip the script on things like that, you know, we have an opportunity for a moment. So go ahead, Dr. Brown.
No, I wasn't gonna. I was sorry. I didn't realize. I don't want to cut you off, but I think Elizabeth, that I see in the chat, had a question.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I just had one question and a comment. My first comment is this. Since I was an undergraduate, one of the things that I've been quite perturbed about is that the discussion about Blacks typically centers on those who are from single parent households and from inner city communities. And it makes sense because these are Blacks that we need to be able to provide assistance to. However, I am Black and I come from a 2-parent household and I was a victim of discrimination. And I'm bringing that up because I have a lot of conservative Christian friends who do make the assumption that the Blacks that are being beaten up by the police and harassed are Black people who are poor. And if they had, you know, better supports at home and weren't on drugs, perhaps they would not have these problems. I'm from a 2-parent household. I'm from a Christian home. And in my kindergarten years, I was called a nigger and told I would be killed if I went to school. And so I think that it is the responsibility of those of us in academia to present more of a diverse understanding of who Black people are. There are plenty of Blacks who live in the inner city who aren't on drugs. They are working and they're still poor. But the only image that people tend to see of Black people are criminals. And so it doesn't surprise me when we have conservative Christians who make this assumption that, well, maybe they're just all criminals. That's why this happens to them. And they tell me these things. And when I look at them and I tell them, do you know what I've experienced? they're literally shocked. And they're like, oh my gosh, we didn't know. And I don't blame them for not knowing because of what they see in the media. And yes, because of the social conditioning, but there's only a voice for Blacks if you fit a certain stereotype. And Blacks that do not exist outside of that stereotype are not heard. And therefore people don't realize that, you know, those of us who work, we go through discrimination too. Those of us who are married, we go through discrimination too. This is deeper than just, you know, a poverty issue. So I just wanted to bring that up. As far as the education system is concerned, I'm so glad about all the policies that are put in place to, you know, ensure that, you know, we move towards inclusion. But another issue that we have within education is that there aren't protections put in place for educators who do advocate for, let's say, children of color or disabled children or whoever needs help. And so even though on paper, or even in people's hearts, even if they see something wrong, they're afraid to speak up. And so my question is, what can we do as social workers to protect the social worker, to protect the frontline interventionists, to protect those who are advocating for those without a voice? So that's the question that I have.
I see Dr. Lee Johnson, he's chairing. Wow, you just laid so much out there for us to consider. Those are the right types of questions to be asking. And, you know, I'm just reminded of the words that, you know, let's seek first to understand. I see comments again from Dr. Flores Carter. Education is so important. Racism is an equal opportunity oppressor from the Reverend Dr. Lee Johnson. Hey guys, this has been such an important conversation for us to start. We're going to continue this professional development series. We have this platform that's going to happen and continue, and have some great colleagues, brothers and sisters in our faculty that's going to continue these discussions. I know from my perspective, I'm happy to continue to engage with you in discussion. I think that Dr. Mexico, Dr. Brown would also be open to emails, to setting up some meetings. If you want some one-on-one time with us, we're happy to do that. I think we could probably go all night with this. And we, as I said at the top of the hour, and I think our Dr. Mexico and Dr. Brown and I, we just wanted to create a space that we could at least start the conversation, start asking questions, start critical analysis, so that as social workers, we can be as educated as possible and to speak from an educated perspective on this really important topic. And we hope that by starting a conversation that we can begin to move just from a moment. And the video that Dr. Brown started with, when he first showed me that video, my comment to him was, I can remember each one of those moments. I can remember every one of those moments as they were replayed on the news for a couple days, maybe a couple weeks, maybe a month, and what happened after those. And what we don't want and we can't let happen this time is that this becomes just another moment. So we want to encourage you to continue this discussion. We're so happy that you were able to join us tonight when you could have been with your family, having dinner, doing whatever else, but you chose to be here because you're dedicated, and we appreciate that. And we just want to encourage the conversation to continue. So in the chat, there's Dr. Brown's email. So just thank all of you again for joining us. This has been wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Lee Johnson, for encouraging us and offering this platform, and also Dr. Gustafson for encouraging us as a department. So with that, I think we're going to sign off for tonight and just encourage you. And we love you, and we pray for all of you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for attending. It means a lot. Thank you so much.